Very happy to have Max Michelson from MIT speak today and tell us about external to swap regret 2.0. And I just found from Max's webpage that he writes a lot of songs related to theory and also performs. So maybe if the audience is receptive, he can perform today too.
We can make that work. Hey everybody. Oh, is that too loud? Is this? Hey everyone. My name is Max. I'm here to talk about our recent work titled From External to Swap Regret 2.0, an efficient reduction for large action spaces. This is joint work with these lovely people here from my group. It's also concurrent work with Bing Lee and Aviad. Check out their paper too. All right. The main result of this paper is an online learning algorithm that achieves no swap regret, online learning in a setting with many actions, okay? But what is swap regret? What's online learning? And why are there so many actions? We're gonna answer all those questions here today. Stay tuned. Let's go. Let's start with the basics of what is online learning. In the setting of online learning, we have some sort of menu of actions, and we're going to repeatedly choose an action. So at every single time step, we're going to make some sort of choice, and then we're going to observe some sort of reward that our choice rewarded us, our action got us, as well as the rewards of all the actions we didn't select. Okay? So the setting of online learning is repeatedly making these choices, somehow adapting from what we've seen, trying to pick the best action. Allowed in this setting is a selection of a random distribution over the actions. We're allowed to play a mixture, in which case our reward will be the mixture of the rewards of the actions that we chose. So formally, we, every single time step as an online learner, select some sort of X, which is a distribution over the actions. Then we receive some sort of reward or utility vector that is, say between 0 and 1 for all these actions. And then we could, at the end of capital T rounds of learning, say that we've incurred some total reward that is, I guess, the dot product of these vectors. Or we could also say we incurred an average per round reward of this quantity. This is, I guess, the quantity we'll be talking about during this talk. When I say the word reward, we'll talk about average reward. Okay, so the setting of online learning is interesting because we assume that these utilities, these rewards, are coming from an adversary, which is in contrast with, I guess, the classical offline setting of learning, wherein we assume that the rewards are coming from some sort of fixed distribution. But that's kind of crazy, right? To assume that the universe is giving us rewards that are coming from some IID distribution every single round. There's a lot of settings in which such an assumption is an unreasonable assumption, especially when the rewards are somehow going to be interfacing with the decisions we're making. Like, let's talk about games for a second. Let's say we're playing rock, paper, scissors against an adversary. So we could take an offline learning approach to this and be like, all right, I know how to play rock, paper, scissors. I'm going to look at the history of what's been played by the adversary. And then I'm going to assume that the adversary is selecting these actions IID. So I can say, oh, clearly this guy is playing too much paper, so I'm just going to start playing scissors. Next thing we know, adversary starts playing rock. And it's like, what happened to the IID assumption? It went out the window. Okay, that's all to say online learning is interesting. Sometimes it's good to consider a setting in which these rewards are coming from an adversarial place, perhaps adaptive to the decisions we're making. So, when we're dealing with an online learning algorithm, the metric of performance of the algorithm we use is the measure of regret, okay? And there's many different notions of regret. I'm sure some of you are familiar with some of the notions of regret, some are familiar with all of them. I'm gonna define regret, at least initially, in a very general sense, but then we'll tie it to the notions of regret that many of you are probably familiar with. So regret is generally going to be, though, the reward that our online learning algorithm attained compared to some sort of benchmark, okay? So, we have some sort of online learning algorithm that, over some series of time is producing, actions x1 to xt in the face of these rewards that it receives. And then we're going to consider comparing the performance of this algorithm, right? So it gets some reward that is this. We're going to consider the comparison of this reward to a transformation of the actions. So there's going to be some sort of transformation fee that is going to, instead of playing x1 to xt, what if we had instead played phi of x1 to phi of xt? and then we could ask ourselves, okay, what would the reward of those actions have been? And I don't mean like, what if we had actually played this in the game and then the adversary would respond in some way? I mean, we do this online learning, and then we just kind of fix the history of everything that's happened. And then we're asking, given these fixed rewards that we see, like how would these actions have performed against those that set of rewards? Okay, so generally how the measure of regret works is we have some sort of set of transformations. Yeah, in the back.
Sorry, this doesn't seem to be consistent with your rock, paper, scissors example.
Mm-hmm.
So was that just, does that contradict what you're saying here? Is it was that, you're not dealing with that case at all?
Yeah, so I mean, this is right now me defining a metric that I'm going to measure the performance
No, I
of.
understand, but
Yeah.
here, when you measure the benchmark,
Mm-hmm.
you're not changing the responses, are you?
That's correct. So again, right. So this is okay. Again, we'll first I'm right. So the setting that I'm talking about is indeed that setting where the responses we're getting are not IID. I'm defining essentially a metric of measure of the performance of such an algorithm. But built into the metric isn't going to be like that intuition wherein we expect the adversary to respond. I think I'm just gonna try to go through the definition, and then on the next slide I'll kind of introduce why this is the correct metric of performance of an online learning algorithm in the face of an adaptive adversary. But indeed, this benchmark that I'm setting does not like encapsulate the adaptivity of the adversary.
So
Yeah.
if we wanted to come up with a setting where we could play against, play in that game setting,
Mhm.
then none of this applies, is it?
No, this does apply. So essentially, this is one way, and we're actually even further going to talk about the interesting implications of players in the game running no regret learning strategies in just a few slides. But essentially, like, yeah, I mean, this is going to tie into the notion of equilibrium in games, as we're going to see. Yeah, I guess could I go through the next few slides and then no. I think I'll be able to answer the question in just a few more slides. Anyways, this is essentially the notion of regret. We're comparing ourselves. Essentially, there's some sort of set of transformations, capital phi. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to run our online learning and then compare our performance, our total reward, to the reward of a transformation of our actions, the best of all the transformations in this capital phi. So that's the definition of regret. Okay, why? Why is this the important metric for evaluating an online learning algorithm? Let's go through some examples of regret, and we'll try to gain some intuition as to why this is an important metric. Okay, so let's start with external regret, which is probably the most common notion of regret, and the notion of regret that many of you may be familiar with. Essentially, in external regret, the set of transformations that constitute our benchmark is going to be just the set of constant maps. Meaning, we're going to be looking at our performance on this online learning task and comparing our performance to the performance of any of a fixed action against this set of rewards. Okay, why would this be an interesting metric? Why would we want to compare ourselves to the best of fixed actions? I guess here's one way to gain intuition, and I'm going to start with explaining it in the offline setting. So like, let's just say we're playing rock, paper, scissors against a non-adaptive adversary, okay? Just some sort of guy who's playing rock too much. Essentially, like, if you wanted to ask, like, how should we, like, deem our performance against this player? Is the goal to like look into their mind and just understand the RNG that goes inside of their mind and like exactly beat them every single round? Like, no. Essentially, like, the goal that we should intuitively set for ourselves is to learn to play paper over time. Like, that should essentially be our metric of performance. It shouldn't just be our absolute reward. It should be how close does our reward match some sort of fixed action. So that makes sense for offline learning. When we get to online learning and we're learning against a general adversary who's going to be adaptive to what we're choosing, we can actually set a stronger benchmark than just the set of fixed actions. And this stronger benchmark, if we perform well against this stronger benchmark, there's going to be even greater implications of what we've accomplished, which we're going to go through. That stronger benchmark is swap regret, okay? So unlike external regret, where we're just competing against fixed action transformations, In swap regret, we want to compete against all maps of the actions to themselves. Okay? What does that mean? Let's say we did some sort of online learning task. We played some action A some rounds, we played some action B some rounds. And let's say that maybe we're actually pretty happy with our performance on those rounds where we played action A. We actually got a good amount of reward on those rounds. But there's these rounds where we played some action B where we're actually not happy. We lost out on a lot of reward. And we would have actually been much happier if the rounds where we played action B, we had instead played some sort of action C, okay? So this is one potential transformation that is captured in swap regret. This would be essentially a transformation where we're mapping all of our times we played A to A, but we're mapping whenever we played B to C. Now, such a transformation is not considered under external regret. We don't have to compete against this transformation to get good external regret. But because we're trying to set a harder goal for ourselves, we're trying to compete with this larger group of transformations, we're going to get richer results if we're able to do so. I've explained this in the pure strategy setting. This obviously can also be generalized to mixed strategies, right? As I described, the player is playing, the learner is playing a mixture over actions at every single round. Under this transformation, if we were swapping action B for action C, it would be the fractional component of action B that we played swap for action C, so this generalizes. But right, as I said, this is strictly more general than external regret. Contained within this set of transformations is the set where we map everything to a fixed action, all the external regret transformations, but it can be anything. It could be switching just one action. It could be switching all the actions to other actions. All of these things are encompassed in swap regret. So why swap regret? I mean, it's this strictly more powerful thing, which makes it inherently interesting. There's a lot of other interesting, there's a lot of other evaluations of online learning tasks that are encompassed within swap regret, such as L2 calibration, for example. But I think the best way to motivate why swap regret is interesting is the setting of games. Where in swap regret learning, if you can do no swap regret learning in games, there's like very cool implications of that. So let's say we have a game, like, yeah, what's up?
Is it correct that you need to have a number of rounds which is significantly larger than the number of players for this to be interesting?
Yeah, so I mean, again, all of these convergence rates, so essentially all of the, as time goes on, the regret or average regret is going to converge to 0. All of those rates are going to be a function of, the epsilon that you want, how close to 0. They're going to be a function of how many actions each of the players has, such as n. They're going to be a function of how many players are in the game. So it's always going to be dependent on all three of those things, at least in the game setting. Essentially, this talk is going to be discussing interesting trade-offs of these parameters. But indeed, I guess yes, there is going to be dependence on the number of actions, yeah.
Maybe my question was simpler. I was just wondering, is it you have to think right that if the number of rounds was smaller than the number of players, then you'd be saying it's comparing it to the best possible offline strategy because this map could be arbitrary. Is that correct, or is that not correct?
So okay, I guess the map is.
Not correct. So I was thinking maybe I'm not correct, but I was thinking if the number of rounds is is smaller than the number of players, then certainly if you're playing different players at different rounds, then you're comparing to an arbitrary strategy. So there's not a meaningful one to be able to say.
So that is correct. So first off, there's a little confusion in the online learning community. Sometimes n is number of players and m is the number of actions. Sometimes m is the number of players and n is the number of actions. That's just where we're at. In this talk, I'm using n to represent the number of actions. So at the first hand, right, indeed, n here represents the number of actions. And I agree that, let's say that n is going to be much more than time, which is actually going to be the setting that we're going to be considering in this talk, when the space of actions is going to be massive, way more than the amount of time. Indeed, if a learner were to play a different action at every single time, which would be a strategy that is available to them, they would get horrible swap regret. They would absolutely, because by playing a different action at every single round, they're competing with all possible transformations. You cannot do worse than that. So when you're dealing with many actions, and this will be a motif in this talk, a key as a learner to achieving good swap regret is limiting the support that you play. And that's going to be an important theme going forward, so I'm glad you touched on that. But let's talk about games really quickly. So essentially, right, let's say we have a game, like rock, paper, scissors, okay? And let's say I want to essentially compute the optimal strategy in this game, which is essentially I want to compute something that is known as an equilibrium in this game, which I'll define in just a second. But one way we can do this, or like I guess for rock, paper, scissors, the equilibrium would constitute playing the 3 actions uniformly at random. This is, in some sense, the optimal thing to do in rock, paper, scissors. One way to compute the equilibrium is using online learning. So what we can do is, for every single player, we can instantiate an online learner and pit them against each other. So at every single round, we're going to have them repeatedly select an action. And from each of these guys' perspective, it's going to be an online learning task. For the guy on the left, the guy on the right makes some sort of action, and that's going to correspond to the reward that the guy on the left observes. Likewise, for the guy on the right, the actions of the guy on the left correspond to his rewards. So we can run these online learning algorithms and produce these actions x1 to xt. And one of the nice guarantees of no regret learning, and another way to motivate regret as a notion of evaluating online learning tasks, is this guarantee that if we're doing no regret learning, we're going to converge to equilibrium. And the type of regret we choose is going to determine the type of equilibrium we converge to. Namely, if we have learners who are running no external regret algorithms, and they each obtain an external regret of epsilon over t rounds, then we have a guarantee that their average strategies over this time interval is going to be an epsilon approximate coarse correlated equilibrium, which I'll define in just a second. On the other hand, if the learners have the stronger guarantee that they attain epsilon swap regret over these t rounds of learning, we have the stronger guarantee that their average strategies converge to a correlated equilibrium in this game, which is a much more powerful notion of equilibrium. Let me explain. So, in a game, essentially, a notion of equilibrium generally is some sort of strategy profile, like a profile of all the player strategies, where no player wants to deviate. Essentially what that could look like is I could go to each of the players in a game, go to, player, this guy and tell him to play action A, this guy tell him to play action B, and this guy and tell him to play action C, and no one will want to do something different than what I've suggested. But, this would not be an equilibrium if one of these players is going to be like, I don't know, Max, I don't want to listen to you. I'd rather deviate and play this action Z, okay? Now, what I mean by deviate can depend on the type of equilibrium we're discussing. So there's something that's called a coarse deviation, which is essentially a player who's going to say, no matter what you tell me, Max, like I don't care what your suggestion is, I'm gonna go with this action, this fixed action Z, I don't care. But then there's also a more sophisticated type of deviation, which is like a swap deviation, which would entail, essentially, when you're telling me to play A, all right, I'm happy, I'll play A. When you're telling me to play B, I'm happy. But it's really like when you're telling me to play C, it's like, I don't know, man, I don't know if I'm gonna listen to you. Maybe I'm gonna deviate and play this different action. So these different types of deviations are going to define the different notions of equilibrium. Essentially, a coarse correlated equilibrium is a strategy profile in which no player wants to make a coarse deviation. Okay? A correlated equilibrium is a strategy profile in which no player wants to make a swap deviation. So that's going to be harder to achieve because, yeah, what's up?
Oh, sorry. Just a clarification. For coarse correlated equilibrium, it's basically saying there's no pure strategy that the player would prefer, right?
Yeah, I mean, so, okay, essentially, okay, it's not necessarily, okay, it ends up being pure because this ends up being like a linear thing. So if there's a good mixed deviation, there's a good pure deviation. It's mostly that it's regardless of what is being suggested to this algorithm. I'm kind of brushing over this a little bit because the main topic of this talk is just swap regret. Okay. This is mostly just motivating swap regret. So I'm kind of brushing over how I'm setting up this game. I'm happy to take it offline and explain in more depth the definitions here.
Thank you.
The point is, swap deviations are a much richer class of deviations. It's going to be much harder to convince a player to not do one of these swap deviations. There's also Nash equilibrium, which I'm sure is the equilibrium concept that most of you are familiar with. In Nash equilibrium, we again have no player wanting to make a swap deviation. But we have this added constraint that the strategy profile must be independent between all of these different players. Essentially, these suggestions are random and they must be independent. And it's actually the independence that makes Nash equilibrium hard. So essentially, we can never hope to get a Nash equilibrium from online learning because the players are going to end up being correlated by their shared history of the game. But more so than that, it's conjectured that there's no polytime algorithm that can compute a Nash equilibrium, given the PPAD hardness hypothesis. So Nash equilibrium is cool, but it's essentially infeasible with a polytime algorithm, assuming the hypothesis. So it's really like this necessity on independence that we must forego. Which is okay, because again, as we said, in an online learning setting, we expect people to be correlated by their shared history. So Nash equilibrium is out of the question. And it's really correlated equilibrium that, in my opinion, is like the polytime, like gold standard equilibrium in games. Because Nash equilibrium is essentially infeasible to compute. And course correlated equilibrium is essentially only a guarantee that players won't want to make a course deviation. But the problem is the set of course deviations is often not very desirable. So you're telling me oh, we have some sort of setting where players don't want to do any of these bad things. And it's okay, you didn't really have to do that much work to convince me that players wouldn't want to do these things. I mean, let's talk about the traffic game. Let's say, we have some sort of intersection and the players are different cars at the intersection. And I have some sort of device that, suggests strategies to the players. So, I want to establish an equilibrium where red means stop and yellow means slow down and green means go. So one possible swap deviation to, this equilibrium would be, okay, you're telling me red, all right, I'm gonna stop. You're telling me green, all right, I'm gonna go. But actually, when you're telling me yellow, I kind of want to actually do something different. I want to speed up, It's possible that this wouldn't constitute a correlated equilibrium because someone might want to do this. On the other hand, a course deviation would have to be some guy who's going to be like, you know what, I don't even want to listen to this. I'm going to close my eyes and just blow through this intersection right now. So if you come to me and you're like, Max, great news. I set up a traffic light. We've got a really desirable course-correlated equilibrium that we've established at this intersection. It's going to be great. And it's all right, all you've done is tell me that no one's going to want to just close their eyes and just blast through this intersection, right? That's not I've not been convinced that this is a point of stability. I'm not convinced that players are going to not do something different. So essentially that's the problem with course-correlated equilibrium. The set of alternatives, the set of deviations that we offer to learners is none of them are necessarily that appealing. And that's to say that, it's not really a point of stability in an inherent sense. So that's why swap regret's important, because you need swap regret to get correlated equilibrium, which is the gold standard of algorithmic equilibria. So, why isn't everyone running swap regret algorithms? I've told you all of this incredible stuff about them, that, all of these guarantees. Why are external regret algorithms a lot more popular in practice? There's classic external regret minimizing algorithms, like the multiplicative weight update algorithm, which will guarantee an external regret of at most epsilon after a number of rounds t that depends logarithmically in the number of actions, and also a factor of 1 over epsilon squared. Now, you also have these classic algorithms that achieve no swap regret learning, and will guarantee a swap regret of at most epsilon with a number of rounds that depends polynomially in the number of actions, and also in terms of epsilon squared. But a lot of the time, this polynomial dependence is going to be a bit of a deal breaker. And the thing is, in real life, there's a lot of actions, you can do this, you can do this. There's really an endless number of things that you can do in this life. I know I introduced online learning in this setting with this nice little menu of 5 actions. But I mean, decisions in this world often entail an entire portfolio over some sort of financial thing, or some sort of complex contingency plan of what actions will I take in all these different states that I could find myself in, which are often exponentially large. So it's often the time that having this polynomial dependence on the number of actions is going to absolutely make this algorithm infeasible. So there's this open question, which is, can we improve on this rate of swap regret learning for large N? 17 years later, we answered it affirmatively. You can do it. Incredible. Hold the applause. Thank you. Wait, I'm gonna drink water. Here are our main results. we establish an algorithm tree swap, which is going to attain a swap regret of at most epsilon given a number of rounds that is this. Now notice, this is going to be having a logarithmic dependence on the number of actions, but there's a trade-off. In having a logarithmic dependence on the number of actions, we're now going to have an exponential dependence on epsilon. And this is a fundamental trade-off that we show with the matching lower bound. This is still a very meaningful bound in settings where often, in terms of epsilon, we're only interested in getting some sort of constant epsilon, like 0.1 or something, where we're having we don't need to get atomically close to what is like a no regret algorithm. But as settings where, again, as I said, the number of actions in complex, environments where there's states and there's contingency planes is often going to be exponentially large in the description. And so having this dependence on log n is often going to improve as long as, epsilon is or 1 over epsilon is at most log n. So yeah, what's up?
Are you only hiding polylog over epsilon?
It's, okay, I don't know why I wrote it like this. It's log n over epsilon squared raised to the power 1 over epsilon. You've all told me to put that. I just thought this looked cleaner. But no, it's just, there's also a polynomial 1 over epsilon squared. Cool. What do we got? We also prove that tree swap can attain a swap regret of this, which is a function of the Littlestone dimension. I won't go too deep into the definition, but if you're familiar with classic learning theory, you know something called the VC dimension, which is something where we could have a hypothesis class that's infinitely large. But as long as it has a finite VC dimension, we're able to do pack learning on it. The equivalent for that, for external regret learning, online learning, is the Littlestone dimension. We could have infinitely many actions, but as long as Littlestone is finite, we can do it. But it was not known for swap regret, if it was ever possible to do no swap regret learning when there's infinitely many actions. We prove that we can do it as long as Littlestone's finite. We also improve the best known swap regret dependence on the number of actions in the bandit setting, where it was previously only known to be n squared, now we get it to linear. There's also all these other open questions that we addressed in different areas of the literature. There's these different settings of computation where we're measuring trying to compute correlated equilibrium as efficiently as possible, measuring communication or query complexity, like how many queries do we make to the entries of the game, that were not known to be able to have this good dependence on the number of actions in the game. We also come up with the first algorithm for computing correlated equilibrium in extensive form games, as long as epsilon's constant, right? So an extensive form game is like a tree structure game, right? You can think of something like chess, for example. The chess is complete information, wherein essentially the size of the number of actions is going to be exponential in the description of the game. I have to, my strategy is a plan in every single state of the game. So, previously to this work, even for constant epsilon, the best thing that was known was computing an extensive form correlated equilibrium, which is between CCE and CE. But now we know that in polynomial time, you can actually compute a correlated equilibrium as long as epsilon's constant. A lot of open questions, all solved. All right, we also got matching lower bounds. We come up with an adversary that can force any learner to incur a swap regret of at least epsilon, as long as time is, if time has to be at least exponential in epsilon, or in the setting where n is small, we have the matching n over epsilon squared bound. The other things that's cooler about our adversary is oblivious. It's purely just a random process, not adaptive. Also, every single round, our adversary is playing point functions, which are essentially, I'm giving you rewards where one action gets a reward of 1 and all the other actions get a reward of 0. So this is a class of rewards that has constant Littlestone dimension. So that is also a matching lower bound for that setting of the problem. We also have another adversary that this algorithm just gets a better dependence on epsilon, not oblivious. It's also in there, we tossed it in. All right, cool. So now I want to talk about algorithms to attain all of these wonderful swap regret guarantees that I've been discussing. If there's any questions about what we've talked about thus far, let me know. I'm drinking water. Cool. All right, let's talk about, from the ground up, algorithms for no regret learning. Let's start with external regret. So how do you do no external regret learning? Well, a classic algorithm like multiplicative weight updates, or MWU, is essentially just going to look at the history of what's happened and do the best thing with some regularity. But it's groundbreaking stuff, right? You know, you're essentially going to, at some time step t, look at all the rewards you've seen thus far, total them up. Let's say it's like this vector. And rather than playing the exact best action in hindsight, we're going to play maybe a soft max over the actions that we've seen thus far. So maybe something like this, where we place most of the weight on the best historical action, but we're going to regularize a little bit, and this is just to achieve a stability round to round of the predictions that we make. So that's how you achieve external regret, right? So how's that's going to go? You know, there'll be, you know, some initial action we play, and then the cumulative reward will update. And then we're going to play the next action, which is, you know, the soft max of the new cumulative reward. The cumulative reward updates. We play the soft max of that. The cumulative reward updates. We play the soft max of that. Keep going. Okay. Now I'm going to introduce a different algorithm for external regret learning that is going to be an important building block in the eventual tree swap algorithm that we're going to describe. So that algorithm is called lazy multiplicative weight updates, lazy MWU. It's essentially going to do the same thing. It's going to look at the history and do the best thing, but only every few rounds. So what does that look like? You know, there's going to be some initial action we play x1. The cumulative reward is going to update, but we're going to chill. We're going to play the same action as last round. Cumulative reward updates. We're going to chill again. We're just going to keep playing that action for a little bit. We're going to update, play the same action. Only eventually, at some sort of time point, do we finally update our action. And now, okay, after this, you know, block of rounds where I played the same exact action over and over, I'm finally going to look at the new cumulative reward and play according to that. Okay? So what does that look like? We have some sort of interval of time from 0 to t. We're going to break it up into m blocks, okay? So that's going to be m blocks, maybe each block is of length b, so like t equals b times m. And what this is going to look like is, you know, for this whole first block, we're going to play the exact same action over and over. At the end of the block, we'll finally look at the cumulative reward and best respond to it, softmax, and play that action over and over, etc. For the next block, we'll repeat. Okay. Why would we do this? Why would we ever want to do this, right? This gets strictly worse external regret. MWU is this guarantee that, if we want to get epsilon external regret, the number of rounds we're going to need, t, is going to be at least log n over epsilon squared. Whereas lazy MWU, if it wants to achieve epsilon external regret, then the number of blocks has to be log n over epsilon squared. This is just, the analysis of this isn't too complicated. So this seems strictly worse, right? Like the number of blocks, like we've just lost a factor of b for no reason. Like why would we ever do this? Why? The point is that the benefit of lazy MWU is that it ends up playing fewer different mixed strategies over time. And because it's playing fewer different strategies over time, the swaps of these actions are going to be more nicely behaved, right? Let's look at one potential swap of these actions. The thing that is nice is that because within a block, we play the exact same strategy over and over, for any different swap function, no matter what, the out result of the swap function will also be a set of strategies wherein it's the same exact strategy within every single block. And that's going to be an important behavior that is going to be necessary. So as I said, this is going to be an important building block in the tree swap algorithm. So I want to describe the tree swap algorithm now. And it's going to use this lazy MWU as a subroutine, okay? The algorithm is composed of a series of different layers. So let me just describe a handful of algorithms really quickly. The first one, okay, so we're just going to make an assumption that time is m to the d for some sort of integers m and d, okay? The first assumption, so let's consider an algorithm that is just the lazy MWU algorithm. We have, you know, this interval of time, we break it up into m blocks, and we run lazy MWU. Okay. We could consider something different though. So this is the second layer. What if we instead did the following thing? So what we're going to do is we're going to take our time and split it into m pieces, okay? But then each piece is itself going to be a instance of lazy MWU, okay? So, you know, this piece is of length like, you know, t over m, okay? And essentially, each of these blocks is now going to be a length t over m squared, okay? So, like, how would this algorithm run? Like, this would be essentially, you know, we're doing lazy MWU here, playing the same action within this block. We update, play the same action, update, play the same action. Then there's the end of this entire algorithm, this entire black box instance. So what that means is that starting here, when we're looking at the cumulative reward thus far, we're just going to refresh. We're just going to start anew, okay? We're just going to ignore all the rounds that came before and choose this next action as if the time started from this point. And then this is going to be lazy MWU. It'll make a little bit of sense why we're doing this. But essentially, we construct these layers as like a tree. We have another layer where we have, time split up into T over M squared blocks. Each of these is a lazy MWU instance that, again, splits that further into blocks of size T over M cubed. We go all the way down to a final layer in which we have, essentially each instance is now of length M. So these aren't even lazy anymore. These are just regular multiplicative weight updates. Each of these blocks is of length 1. Okay, so the tree swap algorithm is essentially going to take all of these different layers. Each of these is an algorithm, right, which uses lazy MWU as a black box. And we're just going to take the average of all D of these algorithms. And that's what we're going to output. So at some sort of time step, represented by this green line, we're going to look at what all of these different algorithms recommend. And we're going to play the average of these D actions, okay? That's tree swap. Why does this get good swap regret? Okay, essentially, you can look at all the different actions that make up a piece of what tree swap plays. We've got these actions at the top, which get played for, blocks of size T over M. We've got actions at the next layer that, get played for blocks of size T over M squared. And we want to compute, we want to ask ourselves, what's the benchmark? We want to ask, what is the best swap of each of these actions to a different action? I've used the letter X here repeatedly. These are all different actions, I suppose. Within a block, it's the same action. I didn't index them. I apologize, okay? We want to swap each of these blocks to something different. So for this block specifically, this block is going to have to compete with the best fixed action over this interval, right? Whatever was the fixed action that competed best against, during the time that this action was present, will have to do well against it. Likewise, this action is going to have to compete against the best fixed action over this interval of time, and this action is going to have to compete against the best fixed action over this interval of time. The same goes for all the other layers. If we go down a layer, this action is going to have to compete with the best fixed action over this interval of time. This will have to compete against this against this, this against this, this against this. I animated all of them, that's correct. Cool. So in total, you add it all up, and this is what we're looking at. It's like all the best fixed actions over intervals of these time versus what the algorithm achieved, right? The swap regret is going to be, I guess, the average reward of this whole right side versus the average reward of that whole left side. We can break that down into, the reward, these algorithms are averaging over these layers. So, we're comparing the average reward over these layers versus the average reward of all the layers on the left. And this sum is going to telescope in a very nice way, a very exciting way. We can rearrange it like this, okay? So we're going to compare the reward of the first layer here to the second layer here. We're going to compare the reward of the second layer here to the third layer there, etc. Let's see what happens when we do this. Let's look at this first term, okay? So again, right, this is the reward of this first layer versus that second layer. And let's look at, I guess like the first block of these terms. So let's look at what is the reward of this, the best fixed action over this interval versus the reward of all of these actions. This is exactly the external regret of that black box instance of lazy MWU, right? That is going to be, right, that is an external regret algorithm that I've circled in red. We know that those actions compete or have good utility comparable to the best fixed action over that interval. Likewise, this fixed action is going to be competed against well with those actions, etc. So for all these actions. When you put this all together, we have that, this like S1 minus R2 term is going to be bounded by, because we're taking the average over time, it's going to be bounded by the average of all of the different external regret instances of the algorithms at that row. And remember that as long as we set M to be at least log n over epsilon squared, all of those instances themselves are going to have average external regret at most epsilon. So that means that this term is at most epsilon. Likewise, for this term, when we're comparing these fixed actions to those algorithm outputs, we know that these are going to correspond to, like this whole term in total is going to correspond to the average of the external regrets of those algorithms, each of which has average external regret at most epsilon. So that's going to be at most epsilon too. And you put it all together and you telescope accordingly, And you have that all of these terms are going to be bounded by epsilon, except for the final term, right? That's the cost of telescoping. There is going to be, a final term here that is simply just the best possible action in every single round, okay? There's nothing we can bound that by other than the worst case of attaining the maximal reward of 1 every single round. But that still means that this is all going to be, the swap regret of this whole thing is bounded by epsilon plus 1 over d. So as long as we set d to be at least 1 over epsilon, this is going to be, O of epsilon total swap regret. And because t is m to the d, as long as t is at least log n over epsilon squared raised to the power 1 over epsilon, we're going to get epsilon swap regret. There you have it, everybody. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for listening. If you're interested in the intuition of how we came up with this algorithm, I wrote like a massive blog post on my website, maxkfish.com. Check it out. I also sing songs there, apparently. Yeah, I think that'll be intuitive. If you're familiar with other swap regret algorithms like Blum-Mansour, we explain how this algorithm was actually inspired by Blum-Mansour in an interesting way. Check it out. There's the references, and yeah, thank you for coming.
Thanks for an entertaining talk and a beautiful result. Any questions?
Yeah, go for it.
The previous slide, was there a factor of m? You're comparing yourself to a lazy multiplicative weight step algorithm for so there should be a block size coming into that?
Yeah, so again, I guess it all comes down to, right, so I've simplified everything by talking about external average regret as opposed to total regret. Indeed, right, like if you want to, like compute this, for the sake of clean slides, I've removed the divide by 1 over t terms to clean things up. But right, indeed, it's like, the total reward of each of these algorithms is going to be, some sort of function of the block size. But then because we're averaging over time, and so it's like we're averaging over the algorithms, so the number of algorithms in the row, and then each of those algorithms is averaging over, I guess, its own interval. So that multiplies to 1 over t, and things cancel nice. If I just write it out, it'll kind of come together in a clean way. But yeah, just try to simplify the slides a little. Anything else? Yeah.
So is the fact that you lose the last layer completely, is that the intuition behind the lower bound too? That you need this exponential in 1 over epsilon?
Okay, the lower bound is lower bound's crazy. Lower bound's also rooted in a tree strategy. I mean, again, I guess it's right. That is one way to kind of intuitively see. If you tell yourself that this is the intuitive algorithm for this task, then this layer is inevitable. Of course, when you actually want to prove a lower bound, I have to somehow show against every possible learning algorithm, right? Like this is just one learning algorithm. We're going to force something. The adversary ends up also doing a construction that's based on a tree. For every single round, we're doing something that it kind of also looks like a DFS of a tree. I kind of explained the intuition of the lower bound too on the website post, but yeah, okay, it would take longer to explain. Essentially, like when you try to beat all possible Blum-Mansour style adversaries, you kind of get into this thing where, okay, how to explain this? Like, listen. Okay, Blum-Mansour is this algorithm that involves Markov chains, okay? So it's like at every single round we have these external regret algorithms that represent the nodes of a Markov chain, and they're all gonna point at each other, or they're all gonna, suggest different algorithms that's gonna induce a Markov chain, and then we play the stationary distribution of this Markov chain. If you try to come up with an adversary that forces, these Markov chain, okay, essentially, you have to have small support to do good swap regret. So you want to construct an adversary that is going to make sure that many different nodes end up in the stationary distribution of these Markov chains, and that essentially the best way to do that is essentially to force the stationary distributions to kind of like do this DFS traversal of a tree, okay? Because I can explain, but I think it's loosely that, but perhaps a little more complicated. Cool.
Maybe you mentioned this concurrent work. Is their algorithm similar as well?
I think they have a similar algorithm.
It's the same, basically.
It's the same. Yeah, there are lower bounds are a little different. Yeah, crazy stuff. All right. Anyways, thanks for coming. Cheers.